The Grand Council of the Galactic Concordat had been meeting for 300 years without interruption. Wars had been avoided, treaties had been signed, and entire civilizations had been absorbed into the great web of interstellar politics without so much as a single shot being fired. The Concordat was proud of this. They called it enlightenment. They called it progress. They called it the natural order of intelligent life. Then humanity showed up. The first human delegation arrived at the council chambers aboard a ship that the Veth ambassadors described as charmingly primitive. It was a boxy, ugly vessel with none of the elegant curves that the older races preferred. It burned chemical fuel in addition to its ion drives. It had no cloaking capability, no energy shielding worth mentioning, and its weapons systems, what few it had, were so underpowered that a karate patrol cruiser could have torn through it in under a minute. The council representatives watched the ship dock from behind the great glass observation ports, and more than a few of them exchanged quiet, amused glances. The humans who stepped off that ship were short by galactic standards. The tallest among them barely reached the shoulder of the average Veth, who stood 3 meters tall on their digitigrade legs. The humans had no natural armor, no venom glands, no bioluminescent threat displays, no pheromone-based communication. Their senses were laughably limited. They could not see into the infrared. They could not hear ultrasonic signals. They had only 2 eyes, and those eyes sat at the front of their skulls, giving them almost no peripheral vision. They smelled of something the translation matrix rendered as salt and effort. Ambassador Dara Okonkwo led the delegation. She was a dark-skinned woman of middle age with gray threading through her hair and a calm, measured expression that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. She wore the deep blue uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a single golden pin on her collar in the shape of Earth's western hemisphere. She shook hands, a bizarre human greeting ritual that involved grabbing another being's limb and pumping it up and down. With the council representatives, smiled easily, and took her seat at the long table without any sign of being overwhelmed. The Veth Council Chair, a towering creature named Velsorith, looked down at her the way one might look at a small, unexpected animal that had wandered into an important meeting. He welcomed humanity to the Concordat with the kind of politeness that is really just a dressed-up form of dismissal. He told her, with great diplomatic care, that humanity's application for full membership would take time to process. There were assessments to be made. There were capability reviews. There were questions about humanity's military standing, their resource base, their technological development index. Okonkwo nodded pleasantly and said that humanity understood completely. What she did not say, what none of the human delegation said, was that they had already been watching the Concordat for 60 years before making contact. 60 years of quiet, patient observation. 60 years of learning languages, studying political structures, mapping fleet movements, cataloging every species' strengths and every species' blind spots. The humans had not stumbled into this meeting. They had engineered it, down to the exact timing, the exact seat arrangements, and the exact words Velsorith would use to greet them, which Okonkwo had predicted with startling accuracy in a briefing document she had written 3 months earlier. But the council did not know any of that. What followed over the next several months was something the other races found quietly entertaining. The humans were subjected to the standard membership evaluation process, which was designed, though no one said this openly, to determine where a new species fit in the hierarchy. Every species had a place. The Veth were at the top, old and powerful and self-assured. The Karate were military enforcers, respected and feared. The Selen were economists, controlling the flow of trade goods across a dozen systems. The Drynn were scientists, their biological research unmatched. And then there were the lesser races, the client species, the ones who provided labor and raw materials and were grateful for the protection the Concordat offered in exchange. The humans, based on everything the evaluation showed, looked like they belonged with the lesser races. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were weak. Their population, spread across only a handful of colony worlds, was small by galactic standards. And worst of all, at least in the eyes of the other council members, humans seemed to have no biological advantages whatsoever. They were soft. They were slow to heal. They had a frustrating tendency to form emotional attachments to things, including each other, which the Veth considered deeply irrational and the Karate considered outright dangerous. Velsorith mentioned this in a private session with the karate ambassador, a being named Grochthon who had the build of a tank and the temperament to match. They agreed that humans were probably harmless, possibly useful as a minor trade partner. Certainly not a threat. Grochthon laughed, a sound like grinding metal, and said that if humanity ever tried to make trouble, the karate could handle them with 2 patrol fleets and a long weekend. Nobody bothered to wonder why. If humanity was so weak, they had managed to survive this long without any galactic allies. Nobody thought to ask how a species with such limited biological gifts had spread to 17 colony worlds in less than 4 centuries. Nobody examined the question of why, despite several early contact incidents between human scout ships and karate patrol routes, there had been no confirmed casualties on the human side. Nobody looked closely at the human ship designs and noticed that they were, underneath the ugly exterior, extraordinarily modular, built to be retrofitted, upgraded, expanded, and repurposed faster than almost anything in the Concordat's catalog. Nobody paid attention to the fact that the human delegation had brought, in addition to their official diplomatic team, a quiet group of individuals who were listed on the manifest as cultural observers. These people sat in the back of every session, said almost nothing, took meticulous notes, and had the kind of eyes that were always watching the exits. Okonkwo did notice all of this. She noticed everything. On the evening after the council delivered its preliminary assessment, which placed humanity at the lowest tier of membership, with limited voting rights and no military representation on the Joint Command, she sat alone in her quarters aboard the human vessel and read through the full report without expression. Then she wrote a single encrypted message back to Earth. It read, "They see exactly what we wanted them to see. Proceed with Phase 2. Back on Earth and across the 17 colony worlds, something had been happening for decades that the Concordat had no knowledge of. Humanity had been building. Not the crude, obvious building of a civilization trying to show off its power. Not the great gleaming warships and orbital platforms that the karate paraded through border systems to intimidate their neighbors. No, humanity had been building quietly, underground and in deep space and in the cold dark between stars. Building in the patient and methodical way of people who have decided they will only get one chance to do this right. They had looked at the galaxy and understood something that the older races had forgotten, because they had been powerful for so long that they no longer remembered what it felt like to be afraid. Humanity remembered. Humanity had spent its entire existence being smaller, weaker, slower, and more fragile than the things trying to kill it. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars, and the deep crushing weight of their own worst instincts. They had learned, at a bone-deep cellular level, that survival was not about being the strongest thing in the room. It was about making sure the strongest thing in the room never saw you coming. In the Concordat's Grand Council chambers, Velsorith filed humanity's membership paperwork under low priority and moved on to more pressing matters. Somewhere in the dark between stars, the first of the Terran Armada's capital ships finished its final systems check, running silent, running cold, and running perfectly on time. Nobody in the Concordat was laughing yet, but they would be, and then they would stop. The incident at Kepler Station started the way most catastrophes do, with someone making a decision they were absolutely certain was the right one. Grochthon, the karate ambassador, had grown tired of the humans. That was the simplest way to put it. They had been attending council sessions for 8 months now, sitting in their low-tier seats, voting on minor procedural matters, and generally being present in the way that a piece of furniture is present, noticed only when someone walks into it. But lately, they had started asking questions. Not aggressive questions, not threatening ones. Just quiet, careful, technically worded questions about things like the Concordat's resource-sharing agreements, the terms under which military escorts were provided to member vessels, and the exact legal definition of what constituted an act of aggression under galactic law. Those questions made Grochthon uncomfortable in a way he could not entirely explain, so he did what powerful beings tend to do when something makes them uncomfortable. He decided to make it stop. Kepler Station was a human-operated waypoint facility, one of 3 that humanity maintained at the outer edges of their claimed space. It was not a military installation. It had no weapons systems of any consequence. It processed shipping traffic, provided fuel, offered medical support to passing vessels, and served as a communication relay for the outer colonies. The humans were quite proud of it. Okonkwo had mentioned it twice in council sessions as an example of humanity's contribution to safe transit in that region of space. Grachthon sent 2 karate cruisers to seize it. The official justification was a trade regulation technicality, something about the station operating within a disputed boundary zone without the proper Concordat transit licenses. It was the kind of charge that could be made to stick if the right people agreed to look the other way, and the right people in this case were the Veth, who controlled 3 of the 7 council votes needed to legitimize the action retroactively. Velsorith, when Grachthon approached him, raised one of his 4 eyebrows and said that technically he supposed it could be argued either way, which in diplomatic language meant yes. The karate cruisers arrived at Kepler Station at 0340 station time, when skeleton crews were on duty and the traffic was light. They broadcast a seizure order and gave the station commander, a human named Lieutenant Yusuf Abra, 26 years old, from Lagos, 15 minutes to comply and evacuate non-essential personnel. What happened next was the first thing that made the karate pause. Abra did not panic. He did not argue. He did not beg. He opened a channel to the karate fleet commander, a veteran officer named Sector Claw Vorin, and in a calm, pleasant voice acknowledged receipt of the seizure order. He then said that he would need to verify the order through proper Concordat channels before complying, which was his legal right under Article 7 of the Galactic Transit Code, a document he proceeded to cite by subsection. He asked whether Vorin would like to be connected to the Council's verification office directly and offered to stay on the line to help facilitate the call. Vorin had seized 17 stations in his career. Not once had anyone cited Article 7 at him. He told Abra that the deadline stood. Abra said he understood and that the verification request had already been transmitted. Then he asked, politely, whether Vorin's crews would be requiring fuel or medical supplies during their wait, because the station was fully stocked and human hospitality protocols required him to make the offer. On the bridge of his cruiser, Vorin stared at the communication screen for a long moment. Behind him, his communications officer was quietly laughing. Vorin told her to stop. Back on Kepler Station, Abra had done 3 things simultaneously while speaking to Vorin. First, he had transmitted the full legal verification request to the Council, not as a real hope of resolution, but as a timestamp. A record, proof that the humans had followed every correct procedure. Second, he had sent a compressed data burst on a frequency the karate did not monitor, a frequency that the Concordat's communication protocols did not even officially list, toward a set of coordinates that were not on any published chart. Third, he had quietly begun moving the station's 12 civilian maintenance workers toward the 2 escape pods nearest the docking ring, making sure they understood it was a precaution and not a cause for alarm. Abra was not afraid. This surprised him a little, honestly. He was 26 years old, and 2 karate warships were sitting outside his window. He thought perhaps he should be more afraid. But his training had been thorough, and somewhere underneath the training was something older and harder. The same thing that had kept his ancestors alive through circumstances that would have broken most other species before they ever reached space. He thought of his grandmother, who had survived 3 coups and a famine and still managed to grow tomatoes in her courtyard garden. He thought she would have found this situation manageable. The 15 minutes expired. Vorin broadcast a final warning. Abra acknowledged it respectfully and noted that the verification request was still processing. Vorin fired a warning shot across the station's bow. Abra recorded it, timestamped it, tagged it with the exact power output and trajectory, and transmitted the recording immediately on 3 separate frequencies. Then he came back on the comm and said, still calmly, that he wanted to note for the record that a weapons discharge had occurred and that all data had been transmitted to the appropriate parties. He asked again whether Vorin would like to be connected to the Council Verification Office. Vorin began to feel, for the first time in his long military career, that something was wrong with this situation. He could not say what. The station was unarmed. The human was compliant in a technical sense. There were no other ships on his sensors. And yet the entire interaction had the feeling of a trap, though he could not find the jaws. He decided to proceed. He ordered his second cruiser to begin docking procedures. At that exact moment, every communication channel in the system exploded with traffic. The verification request Abra had filed had triggered an automatic notification to all Concordat members, a feature of Article 7 that Voron's legal team had apparently not read carefully. 43 member species were now receiving real-time updates about the Kepler station situation. More importantly, the data burst Abra had sent to those unlisted coordinates had arrived at its destination, been processed, and generated a response. The response appeared on Voron's long-range sensors as 17 contacts, emerging from deep space positions in a loose encirclement pattern, none of them transmitting identification signals, all of them running at combat power levels that his system struggled to categorize because the energy signatures did not match anything in the Karate database. Voron's sensor officer said, slowly, that she was reading the contacts as ships. Human ships, based on the hull configurations. But they were not like any human ships on record. They were enormous. They were dark. And they were positioned, with geometric precision, at every viable exit vector from the system. Voron opened a channel to the lead contact. A voice answered, not Okonkwo's diplomatic tones. Someone else. Someone whose voice had the flat, even quality of a person who has made all the decisions they need to make and is simply waiting for events to proceed. The voice said, Sector Claw Voron. This is Admiral Co. Jinho of the Terran Armada. You fired on a civilian installation. We have complete sensor records. The Concordat has been notified. You have 20 minutes to withdraw your vessels from this system. I will not be repeating this offer. Voron looked at his sensor display. 17 contacts. None of them transmitting. All of them waiting. He withdrew. By the time he filed his report with the Karate High Command, the story was already spreading through council channels. The sensor data, the legal records, the communications transcript, all of it distributed by the humans with the kind of efficient, quiet precision that made it clear they had anticipated this moment and prepared for it carefully. The Concordat members who had laughed at humanity's primitive ships and soft biology read through the data and began, slowly, to recalculate. They had made an error somewhere. They were not sure where yet. They would find out. The emergency session of the Grand Council convened within 48 hours of the Kepler station incident, which was, by Concordat standards, extraordinarily fast. Normally, emergency sessions took weeks to schedule. There were procedures. There were preliminary hearings, notification requirements, agenda-setting processes, and a deeply ingrained institutional tendency to treat urgency as something that happened to other, less dignified civilizations. But the sensor data from Kepler had been circulating through council channels long enough that even the Veth, who prided themselves on their unshakable composure, were asking questions that nobody had good answers to. 17 ships. Unknown class. No transponders. Energy signatures that didn't match anything in the Concordat's catalog. Positioned with a tactical precision that two independent military analysts, one Karate and one Selen, had separately described using the same word, professional. Velsorith opened the session. He looked older than he had 8 months ago, or perhaps it was just the lighting. He stated the facts of the incident in careful, neutral language, avoided assigning blame directly, and then said that the council required a full accounting from the human delegation regarding the nature and extent of their military capabilities. His tone made it clear this was not a request. Okonkwo arrived at the session with 3 members of her team and the same calm expression she had worn on the day she arrived. She took her seat, the low-tier seat, the one that faced slightly sideways, the seat designed for species that the council wanted to see but not quite look at directly, and she waited for Velsorith to finish. Then she smiled the way a person smiles when they have been waiting for this particular conversation for a very long time. She said that humanity was happy to answer the council's questions, and that perhaps it would be helpful to provide some context first. What followed was 3 hours of controlled revelation, delivered with the unhurried precision of someone reading from a document they had written years in advance. Okonkwo did not boast. She did not threaten. She did not raise her voice once. She simply explained, in the same clear and respectful language she had used in every council session, the things that humanity had chosen not to share during the membership evaluation process. She explained that humanity had been aware of the Concordat for 63 years. That during those 63 years they had studied every member species, every alliance, every military doctrine, every known weakness in Concordat border coverage, and every historical precedent for how the organization treated new members it considered non-threatening. She explained that humanity had found the evaluation process genuinely useful, not for learning about the Concordat, but for confirming what they had already suspected, that the Concordat's evaluation framework was optimized to assess species that thought about power the way the Concordat did. And humanity did not. She brought up the holographic display, which her team had connected to the Council's main projection system the previous evening, claiming it was needed for a trade data presentation. The display now showed something different. It showed a map, not the Concordat's map of known space, a different map with different markings, different routes, different strategic designations. It covered the same territory but saw it entirely differently, the way a sailor sees a coastline differently from a soldier. The council members stared at it. The karate ambassador Grach Thon, who had ordered the seizure of Kepler Station and was currently very aware that this fact was documented in exhaustive detail across every Concordat channel, leaned forward with an expression that was doing its best to look neutral and mostly failing. Okonkwo explained the map. She explained the 17 ships, and then she corrected herself. There were not 17. There were 112, currently holding positions in the deep space zones between major transit corridors, zones that the Concordat did not patrol because they were considered strategically unimportant. They were unimportant to the Concordat because the Concordat moved through corridors, along predictable routes, like freight along a highway. The humans had mapped the spaces between the highways, and they had been living in those spaces for 20 years, building and waiting and watching. She explained the ship design philosophy. The ugly, boxy hulls that the Veth had found so charmingly primitive were, in fact, the exterior of a modular combat architecture that had been specifically designed to be underestimated. Each vessel could reconfigure its internal systems within 6 hours, shifting from a diplomatic transport to a combat vessel to a mobile logistics platform to a forward medical facility. The energy signatures that had confused the karate sensors were the result of a drive system that humanity had developed independently, based on principles the Concordat had explored briefly 80 years ago and then abandoned as impractical. The humans had not abandoned them. They had spent 4 decades making them practical. She explained the deep space building programs. The orbital facilities that the Concordat's long-range scans had occasionally detected but categorized as mining operations. The colony ships that had disappeared into uncharted space and were listed in Concordat databases as lost. The enormous quantity of materials that had been moving through human space on routes that, if you drew them on a map, looked random. They were not random. They were the supply lines of a construction program that had been running without interruption for 31 years. The council chamber was very quiet. Grachthon said, because he had to say something, that this was a violation of the Concordat's transparency requirements for member species. Okonkwo turned to look at him, and he had the experience, rare in his long military career, of wishing he had said nothing. She pointed out, gently but with surgical precision, that humanity had not been a full member when most of this activity occurred. She pointed out that Grachthon's own seizure order for Kepler Station had been filed without council notification, which was itself a violation of 3 separate articles of the Transit Code. She pointed out that all of this was in the record, clearly time-stamped, and had already been transmitted to the 43 member species who had received the Article 7 notification. Then she paused, and for a moment the mask of diplomatic calm slipped just slightly, and something else showed through. Not anger, not triumph. Something more like the expression of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally decided they are done. She told the council that humanity had not come to the Concordat looking for protection. They did not need it. They had not come looking for resources or trade routes or political alliance, though they were willing to discuss all of these things in good faith. They had come because they had looked at the galaxy and seen an organization that had stopped asking certain questions, hard questions, uncomfortable questions, and had decided that silence was the same thing as safety. And humanity, more than almost anything else, understood that silence was never the same thing as safety. The DRYNN Council representative, an ancient and quiet being who had said almost nothing in 8 months of sessions, spoke for the first time. She asked Okonkwo, in her thin and careful voice, what humanity wanted. Okonkwo looked at her and answered without hesitation. She said that humanity wanted a seat at the table that was not designed to face sideways. She wanted full voting rights on matters affecting human-adjacent space. She wanted the Kepler station incident formally recognized as an unlawful act of aggression with appropriate accountability. And she wanted the Concordat's military command structure reviewed by a joint committee, humans included, to address the border security gaps that humanity had identified, because those gaps were real and something had noticed them, something that was not human and was not any of the species in this room, and humanity had been watching it for 7 years. That last part created more silence than anything else she had said. She let the silence sit there for a moment, because she was very good at knowing when to speak and when to let a thing breathe. Then she said that she had a briefing document, if the council was interested. Every being in the room said that they were. Outside the council station, in the dark and measured distances of deep space, the Terran Armada held its positions. Not threatening, not retreating, simply present in the way that a mountain is present, patient and permanent and indifferent to whether or not it is being taken seriously. It had always been there. They had just never known where to look. The thing humanity had been watching for 7 years did not have a name yet, because the species that had sent it did not communicate in ways that translated cleanly into any language the Concordat used. They communicated in action, in pattern, in the particular grammar of a civilization that had decided, some unknowable time ago, that the galaxy's inhabited systems represented a problem to be solved rather than neighbors to be acknowledged. The humans called them the choir, not because they sang, but because of the way their fleet movements worked. Dozens of vessels acting in such perfect coordination that the behavior looked less like a military operation and more like a single enormous organism moving through space. There was no flagship. There was no central command vessel that could be targeted and taken out to break the formation. Every ship was the command vessel. Every ship was also nothing more than a single voice in something much larger, and the whole shape of the thing was only visible if you had been watching it long enough to understand the pattern. The Concordat had not been watching long enough. The humans had. Admiral Co. Jin-ho delivered the briefing personally, via secure holographic link, to the assembled council in a room of military advisors representing 8 different species. He was a compact, gray-haired man who had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the calmest person in difficult situations. He spoke without dramatic pauses or emotional inflection, the same way he might read coordinates from a navigation chart, and the effect was somehow more unsettling than if he had been agitated. Calm people with complete information were often the most frightening thing in any room. He showed them the choir's trajectory data. 7 years of observation, plotted across a holographic star map, that updated in real time from feeds the humans had been running without the Concordat's knowledge. Observation platforms in deep space, passive sensor arrays seeded through star systems the Concordat considered uninhabited, long-duration probe networks running silent on batteries that had been designed to last a decade. The choir had entered what the humans defined as the outer observation boundary 4 years ago. In the last 14 months, their movements had shifted from exploratory to systematic. They were mapping. They were assessing. They were doing exactly what humanity had done 63 years ago, with one critical difference. The humans had arrived at the Concordat seeking dialogue. The choir's approach vector was aimed at the Concordat's most populated core systems. The council chamber absorbed this information in stages. There was denial first, which was natural, and Velsorith managed it with the dignity of someone who has always considered dignity more important than comfort. Then there was the technical objection phase, in which the karate military advisors challenged the data, questioned the methodology, and proposed alternative interpretations that were progressively less convincing as CO walked through each one with the patient thoroughness of a teacher who has anticipated every wrong answer. The Cellin economists immediately began running resource projections that nobody had asked for, but that were probably accurate and definitely alarming. The DRYNN scientist representative asked 7 questions in rapid succession about the choir's propulsion system, all of them good questions, and CO answered 6 of them and told her the 7th was still being worked on. Then the room ran out of things to argue about and sat with the reality. Grach Thon, who had said almost nothing since the previous session, spoke in a voice that had gone quieter than his normal battlefield register. He asked CO, directly and without political framing, whether the karate fleet could handle the choir if it came to a confrontation in the next 2 years. CO said no. Grachthon asked whether the combined Concordat fleet could handle it. CO said probably not, based on current doctrine and formation tactics, which were optimized for species-on-species engagements between forces with identifiable command structures. Grachthon was quiet for a moment. Then he asked whether the Terran Armada could handle it. CO said that the Terran Armada had been designed, from the beginning, for exactly this kind of threat. He said this without pride and without apology, in the tone of someone stating a specification. He explained that humanity's entire military development program had been shaped by the awareness that the galaxy was very large and very old, and that something in it had, at various points in history, ended civilizations that had not seen the threat coming until it was too late. He had a list of those civilizations, compiled from archaeological surveys and deep space artifact analysis, if anyone wanted to see it. 7 species, advanced enough to have reached for the stars, now reduced to ruins that the Concordat had catalogued as ancient sites of unknown origin and moved on from. The humans had not moved on. They had read those ruins very carefully. The Council needed time to process. The Council needed, more urgently, to make decisions, and in the Concordat's 300-year history, the process of making decisions had never been required to move at the speed that the current situation demanded. Okonkwo sat through 2 hours of procedural debate about emergency authority protocols, listening without visible impatience to arguments about whether the situation met the technical definition of an existential threat under Article 19 versus Article 23, and whether the declaration of joint military cooperation required a 2/3 majority or a 3/4 majority, and whether joint military cooperation could even include a species that had not yet been granted full membership status. She let it run. She had learned, long ago, that there was a point in every negotiation where the other party needed to argue their way to the conclusion you had already reached. Interrupting that process only made it take longer. You had to let people walk themselves to the door. After 2 hours, the DRYNN representative looked at Okonkwo and asked her what humanity recommended. Okonkwo had the recommendation ready. Of course she did. It had been written months ago, refined over the course of 8 months of council observation, and cross-checked against 17 different political scenarios by a team of analysts on Earth who had done nothing else for the past year. She had memorized it. She presented it as a series of practical steps, each one building on the last, each one carefully designed to give the existing council structure a meaningful role so that the transition did not feel like displacement. Full membership for humanity, effective immediately, with all associated voting rights. A joint military command council, with representation weighted by capability rather than seniority, which in practice meant significant human representation without making it feel like a coup. Immediate integration of human sensor networks into the Concordat's communication grid, which would give every member species real-time data access that was decades ahead of their current capability. A redeployment plan for Concordat fleets, shifting them from corridor patrol into the strategic positions the humans had already identified, using the Terran Armada as the primary maneuvering force while the other fleets handled perimeter stabilization. And one more thing. She said this part carefully, because it was the hardest part, the part that required the most from the species sitting around that table. She said that when the choir came, not if, when, the response could not be purely military. The choir's behavior patterns suggested they responded to demonstrated capability, but also to demonstrated resolve. They had bypassed 2 systems in their current sweep, and the common factor between those 2 systems was not military strength. It was something harder to measure and easier to underestimate. The humans had a word for it in 43 languages. The most direct translation from Standard Terran was simply, the willingness to still be here tomorrow. She said that what the Concordat needed to show was not just a fleet. It needed to show a civilization that had decided, collectively, that it was not finished yet. The vote took 11 minutes. It passed unanimously, which had never happened in 300 years of Concordat history. In the weeks that followed, the Terran Armada came out of the dark. Not all at once, and not with any ceremony. The humans specifically requested no ceremony, which the Veth found quietly admirable and the Karate found confusing. The ships appeared at the agreed coordinates, their true hulls visible now without the running dark configuration, and they were extraordinary. Not beautiful in the way the Veth designed beauty, not imposing in the way the Karate designed intimidation. They were built the way something is built by people who have thought very carefully about what they might face and have tried, with every resource and every hour and every hard choice over 30 years, to be ready for it. Velsorith, watching the Terran fleet take its position on the long-range display, said something to his aide in a low voice. The aide asked him to repeat it. Velsorith said that he was trying to remember when exactly humanity had stopped being the smallest species in the room. His aide thought about it. She said she believed that the humans had never actually been the smallest species in the room. They had simply been the most patient. Velsorith considered this. He looked at the display for a long time. Then he said that he supposed patience was a kind of strength after all, and that perhaps the Concordat had been using the wrong measurements. Out in the deep dark, the choir continued its approach, vast and coordinated and deeply certain that what lay ahead of it was the same thing that had always lain ahead of it, something that would scatter, something that would fragment, something that had not yet understood that the universe did not negotiate. It had not yet seen what was waiting. It would. And the galaxy, ancient and enormous and full of its own long silences, would remember the moment when something small and soft and stubbornly alive decided that enough was enough, held its ground, and did not move.